Introducing the Hi Fi Mechanik's LP12 tips. Tip 14 of 25.
The main bearing and the bearing housing are by far the most critical components of the LP12, and as such they really do need to be treated with care. Unfortunately, I see a frightening amount of videos out there of people showing exactly the wrong thing to do with the bearing and the bearing housing regarding maintenance, but we're going to cover that, and hopefully we'll show you what we believe to be the correct way. This video is split into 6 sections: main bearing maintenance, bearing housing maintenance, how to identify if the bearing is worn, what oil to use, how much oil to use, and finally a little note about rubber deposits which may appear on the rim of the subplatter. Now, if you've owned an LP12 and it was purchased and installed by an approved Linn dealer, and you haven't transported it, you haven't had any reason to take the main bearing out of the bearing housing and transport it anywhere, then it's very likely that your bearing is in near perfect condition. We don't recommend that you just take the subplatter out to just check the bearing wear, mainly because there is a risk of putting contaminants back into that perfect bearing housing. So we want to avoid that at all costs. And the other thing is, these videos are really targeted to owners and enthusiasts of second-hand LP12s. So if you are watching this and you've bought your LP12 from a main dealer and you have any concerns about it, our advice really is that you should refer back to your main dealer for any servicing or any queries you might have regarding the performance of the deck. You need to absolutely avoid using any cloths or towels in contact with the surface of the main bearing. You're more likely to create minor scoring on the bearing or contaminate the bearing with particles of fibres. So what we use is compressed air, and we use that to chase from the tip of the bearing down to the bottom of the spindle. We chase down the oil and contaminants down to the bottom of the spindle, and then we can simply mop up the excess oil with then a paper towel. So absolutely nothing comes in contact with the surface of the main bearing. You never want to use paper towels or cloths inside the bearing housing itself to remove dirt. You'll simply grind in more dirt, and fibres from the cloths will also collect inside the bearing housing, and these fibres will stick to the oil like a magnet. So this needs to be avoided at all costs. So instead we simply put a little bit more oil in as a flush. We pop the bearing cap on, give it a good shake, and then we pour out the remaining oil. Again, you never want to lay the inverted bearing housing onto paper towels, because again you can introduce contaminants into the lip of the bearing housing, which can then be drawn in. So you want to just support the bearing while it's being flushed, and in this case we've just made a little makeshift cardboard support for the bearing housing, and we just leave it for a while to empty out, and you can repeat this process a couple of times if need be. So in this section, we're going to compare a worn bearing with one in good condition, and we're going to use three methods to identify them. Firstly, will be physical wear on the surface tip. Secondly, will be a sonic test of how much noise is being generated. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the amount of friction, which reduces the platter's freedom. So just having a quick look and comparing the two bearings. The first bearing only has 3 witness marks, as we call them, and basically they're just very, very mild wear points. Now, if we compare that with our known worn bearing, you can see that the tip of it actually looks quite flat, and there are many tiny consecutive circles of wear on that flat surface. So the difference here is really quite obvious. Bit of a spoiler alert, you can see here instantly which of the two has the greater noise, but we'll play them for you now so you can hear it for yourself. So obviously our top example has a lot more noise, and this noise and energy will be going straight into the stylus and affecting the sound performance. So on this test alone, we can certainly say that this bearing needs replacing. Now, this friction test I find fascinating. I'm just moving the platter on the right by a reasonable amount just to get it going, and the one on the left, which we suspect has more wear, as you can see, I'm giving it a far greater kick, and we'll just let them slow down at their own pace and see what happens. So after all of these tests, it's obviously clear that our bearing, which is more worn, is creating noise. It has a far higher amount of friction, and obviously has a very obvious physical wear. So basically, this needs to be thrown away or maybe used as an expensive cake stand. Bear in mind, our freer bearing is still over 30 years old. So if your deck is maybe 10, 15 years old or 20 years old and it's in good condition, then it should even be freer than our example. Now, you need to be aware of a red herring here. If you simply just rotate the platter and look at the amount of freedom or friction that it holds, you may come to the wrong conclusions. There is the rare situation whereby you may simply just have a slightly tight bearing, in which case it may come to a stop more quickly than some, maybe our examples. But if you take a look at the bearing tip itself and the noise generated, you can easily pick up a cheap stethoscope on the likes of online retailers to judge how noisy the bearing wear is. But if there's next to no bearing wear, there's no real marks so far as witness marks are concerned, but the rotation of the bearing is a little bit tight, then the likelihood is it's fine. It's just a tight fit, and that's not the end of the world. It does happen occasionally, and it'll probably be perfectly fine. I honestly believe it's a bit of a false economy to use a non-official Linn oil in the bearing housing. To be fair, it's the most critical component, and for the sake of a couple of quid, you might as well put the right stuff in there, and the end result will be years and years of reliable use. There was an instance of the combination of the gold bearing housing with the white liner. When it's used with the black oil would actually cause the lining of the bearing housing to expand and actually cause a seizure. I think this is incredibly rare, but in my opinion, I really think it's best just to stick with the official correct oil. So below 70,000 serial number, use the clear oil. Above 70,000, use the black oil. There's a lot of discrepancy regarding how much oil to put in to the bearing housing, and I've seen some forums and people recommending 25 drops, and on other locations some people saying, oh no, it's 50 drops, and obviously this is all completely dependent on the diameter of the hole in the oil nozzle. And I really think in this situation it's far better just to put the whole amount in rather than try and count how many drops, because if you don't put the correct amount in, you could damage the bearing. So put the whole lot in, and it's the only way to be sure, as Ripley once said.
So we'll take a look at these rubber deposits. This actually looks a little bit more like staining, but we'll try and remove it anyway. So I'm just pouring a little bit of isopropyl alcohol into the cap of the bottle, cotton bud, just to not get too much on and wipe off any excess. I've popped my gloves on for this. Obviously, we're trying to remove the rubber deposits and at the same time degrease the surface for the belt to rest upon. I'm wearing gloves, and when the cleaned subplatter needs to go back in, you would want to wear gloves. I do appreciate in my earlier example I wasn't wearing gloves, but it hadn't been cleaned at that point. It was only really for demonstration purposes. So we're just speeding up this part of the process. We're just going around the entire rim. As you can see, it's actually not really making a dent. It's not lifting this shadowing off at all. We've done what we can. I'm now using a microfiber cloth just to give it a little polish. I do find it quite interesting that this shadowing on this subplatter doesn't seem to be lifting off. Now, our original example, which we were comparing for wear, which is the 30-year-old subplatter, didn't have any such staining. So my suspicions are aroused that maybe this particular subplatter was not using a genuine Linn belt, and as such the quality of the rubber has stained the subplatter. It's only a thought. I think it's a possibility.
If you use Brasso or T-cut to remove these deposits, which you might well do, unfortunately the other thing which you'll do is remove the protective lacquer coating, and you don't want to do that. What it actually does is changes the resonant frequency of the platter itself, so therefore you do actually end up changing the sound performance.
I really appreciate you watching this video. Please remember to like and subscribe and ring the bell and catch our latest release the day it drops. Disclaimer. These videos and tips are created for information only and represent the personal opinions, information and procedures of the Hi Fi Mechanic. The Hi Fi Mechanic does not accept any responsibility including damage, loss, injury or death as a result of undertaking your own tests, upgrades or enhancements. We strongly recommend contacting your local dealer for a professional service.